to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am very pleased to be joined by my co-hosts, Devanya Havis and Rick Lee. And today, we're going to be talking about the Establishment Clause, or the separation of church and state. But before we get into that, let's get some drink orders and find out what everyone's ranting or raving about. Devanya, let me go to you first. What are you drinking?
Well, today, Lee, I am having a Bengal spice tea. It's a nice herbal tea. It needs no sweetener, and it's kind of yummy. I'm on a tea kick.
I can tell.
And I guess I am going to rave because I've been ranting so frequently the last few episodes. And today, I want to have a basic just shout out to the joy of friends. The joy of having people who show up, give you a call, who check in on you from time to time, who motivate when things are looking glum and I want to hide under my covers. And so a shout out to my friends.
Hear, hear.
Amen to that. Rick, what about you, friend?
Well, today I need a good stiff drink, and so I'm going to have a wild turkey on a rock. Like Devanya and Lee, you mentioned this in previous episodes, there is so much to rant about that I feel like I need to rave more. So today I am raving about the BBC series Shakespeare and Hathaway. So this is a series I've been watching through BritBox. They're private detectives, and so it's a mystery series, but it's also incredibly funny. They are an unlikely pair, a younger woman, maybe in her 40s or so, and he seems like he's in his 60s and kind of disheveled and unkempt. It's just really funny, and even the mysteries they sometimes get involved in are funny mysteries. And so, you know, when executive orders are overwhelming you and you want to just crawl under your covers, turn on Shakespeare and Hathaway. Lee, what about you?
Well, I think I'm just going to have a dirty martini today. I am also going to be raving, along with my friends, about a show that I discovered when I was in England this past Christmas, and it's called Gogglebox. This program is hilarious. Basically, they just take everyday Britons, come into their home, and watch them watching television. And so Gogglebox is basically a show where you get to see people's reactions to whatever happened on TV that week. I can't possibly describe to you how fantastic this is. I know we all feel this when we're watching a show that everyone's watching right now, and you think, oh, I wish I could see like how other people reacted to this scene. But it's also the news, how they react to news reports.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm shocked that we don't have something like this in the United States. Apparently, there's a Gogglebox Australian version and maybe some other countries, but we really need to bring this to the United States. It is absolutely fantastic. So, Devanya, I know today we're going to be talking about the separation of church and state, or the lack thereof. How do you want this conversation to go?
Well, Lee, I've been looking at the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, and I just want to quote it for our listeners in case you haven't been tuning into your U.S. Constitution of late. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that we've come to know as the Establishment Clause. So part of my question, as we move into this conversation about the separation between church and state, is what is the damage that happens when we link church and state? Clearly, our founders were very keen on not having a state-sponsored religion as there was when we were aligned with Britain, and Britain continues to have a state relationship with a church. Freedom of religious expression was one of the things that led people to America as a colony, to the United States. And 6 of the original 13 states, prior to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, had established religions that channeled state funds to the favored religious denomination. It seems to me that in recent times, there has been a much more narrow interpretation of what it means to separate church and state. So I'm wondering, is the increased coherence of religion with the state a threat to democracy? Is it possible, and I would argue this, having observed things in the Black church, that there are religious relationships that move us more toward a common good rather than further from it? And what kinds of religious practices actually might threaten our democracy? We are hearing increasingly political rhetoric that I think draws upon religious definitions for things, how we understand sex and gender, insisting upon binary notions of sex and gender and calling anything that does not buy into those definitions somehow a form of indoctrination. And so I wanted to get a better sense of what the U.S. Constitution tells us about this relationship. I'm no expert on the Establishment Clause, and I had a nice chat with law school professor friend of mine, Rebecca French. I'll give her a shout out. And I said, you've been teaching this for a while. Talk to me about the current issues going on with separation of church and state. And in effect, there are varied interpretations. Narrow interpretations or broader interpretations. These largely emerge out of practice in terms of adjudicating case law, specifically those kinds of cases that find their way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Traditionally, there's been a broader interpretation of this separation between church and state, throwing down the gauntlet, so to speak, around religious messaging coming from state or federal entities. For example, can I put up the 10 Commandments in my courtroom, as a recent Louisiana judge insisted upon doing? Can I have a Hanukkah menorah in City Hall? Can I demonstrate my religious commitments in what should be secular spaces? And anything that did that traditionally had been considered a mixing or a crossing of that separation between church and state. Now, the narrow definition of this separation has leaned more into whether or not state or federal entities are financing religious entities or organizations. Are my tax dollars going to support a religious institution or a parochial school? And I know schooling has been one of those touchstone issues. There used to be prohibitions against tax dollars going to parochial schooling. With a narrower interpretation, if anyone can utilize tax dollars, say, for non-public schools, parochial schools can be folded in, and that would be perceived as a narrow interpretation of the Establishment Clause. And these narrow interpretations have been associated with originalism. Did the founders intend this strict kind of separation?
Devanya, as you were separating these two, the strict and the broad versions, one way to put this is the narrow interpretation does not see the First Amendment insisting on a separation of church and state. And so it's sort of eroding what we used to call the separation in the sense that one will have nothing to do with the other. The state will have nothing to do with any church whatsoever. There will be no funding of anything related. There will be no religious symbols in public institutions and publicly funded spaces and texts and so on. And it seems to me that lately, as the narrower interpretation has come more and more to the fore in the Supreme Court, they've denied that this First Amendment requires a separation of church and state. And that bothers me, and we can talk about why that bothers me.
And I have mixed feelings about this. I have to say, I grew up in the South, in the Bible Belt. There were prayers before many of our public and community events. When I came north, I was like, oh, we're not praying public. Like, there are clear ways in which regional differences speak to how people are interpreting the relationship between state and religious affiliation. And people often feel moved to understand religion as a locus of moral guidance. And so I can understand the impulse, but I also wonder to what extent our commitment to a secular space works against the ways in which we want to seek the common good. Doesn't that impede our ability to think deeply about what is best for the least among us?
I want to come back to this point in a minute, which I hear as you asking, don't we kind of have a civil religion already? I mean, we certainly have values that we share in common. We certainly have rituals and symbols, the Pledge of Allegiance, the American flag. Do those constitute some kind of a religion? And if they do, what makes them meaningfully different than theistic religions? I think that's an important question. We should come back to it. But I want to just speak for a second about prayer in public spaces or civic spaces, because at least when I was growing up, and we're all about the same age, so I'm assuming this was true of you too, that was the main issue.
I'm only 25.
Okay. But that was the main thing that people were arguing about. It was always about prayer in schools. And I just want to say for the record that as long as there are tests in school, there are going to be prayer in schools. So you cannot ban prayers from schools. But it was the idea that it shouldn't be established as a part of the school day or as a part of the school practices or whatever.
Right.
Which I largely agree with. I think now it's not so much about prayer in school, although that thing's never going to go away. It's become about all these other things as well that have to do with really business concerns. Like, can people be forced to make a gay wedding cake and stuff like that? And there, I think we have to recognize that this discourse about the separation of church and state or the non-establishment of state-sanctioned religion has developed as churches themselves have become more like businesses. One of the things that I think we do have to worry about is that the more we treat churches like businesses, the easier it is to allow for their encroaching into our civic life.
That took a turn toward the end that I was not expecting, because I don't know that we have to allow the encroachment of them. And perhaps not allowing the encroachment of religion in our public life is one way of decorporatizing and definancializing our religious institutions. Here's my position. I'll just lay it out as clearly as I can. I don't really care what moral motivations, emotional motivations, rational motivations bring you to the public discourse. You cannot use those private motivations as part of that public discourse. And I put religion in that category. If you consider a progressive tax system part of the message of Jesus, that's fine with me. I could care less about that. If that is the public agreed upon legislated ground of any laws, then I have a problem. I know people will bristle against my saying religion is a private thing. I don't mean necessarily that it's something in your heart. What I mean is it's not something that we can perform together in public. And by public, I don't mean churches and, outside. I mean the public space in a way that someone like Hannah Arendt would talk about it, or other philosophers. That is the space that is constituted as being neither private nor religious. That would be the public space.
I take this to be what you mean, but just to make it a little bit clearer, I think what Rick is saying is not that we can't involve our religious commitments in public discussion, but that we can't expect that other people have to adopt those same religious commitments in order to make decisions in common, civic decisions. So I think we all know that there are many different value systems, religious and secular value systems, that you can come from and with other people arrive at some kind of shared conclusion or shared, in this case, legislation that you have different reasons for supporting. But in order to get there, you have to grant that everyone has their own private commitments, and those private commitments can't be forced on each other. the discourse has to be guided by things that we can talk about in common, that don't require the kinds of private commitments that religious organizations do.
Here. I fully agree with that friendly amendment to what I was saying.
And it sounds like, Lee and Rick, you're suggesting that there is a point when private commitments begin to encroach upon others who do not believe strictly in the way that one might believe, right?
Sure.
So if I have a strict interpretation of the Bible, the Christian Bible, for example, and I believe that this is written in a certain way, there are certain claims that I am deeply committed to that may run in the face of someone who is an agnostic. And in a public discourse, we need not agree on the fundamentals of religion or God in order to, in the public sphere, adjudicate what might be best for how our government is functioning.
Right. And I think a kind of obvious example of this is something like how we regulate, for example, food. So I might, because of my own private religious beliefs, and I don't mean private meaning that they're only mine, but they are shared by me and my community, religious community. I might think that it is immoral to eat things that have hooves or scales or pretty faces or whatever, you know. I mean,
Or meat at all.
yeah, right. That's what I meant.
Could you list the species that are in the pretty face branch of
Pandas? I don't know.
Capybaras?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Don't eat capybaras, people.
Okay. But you see what I'm saying. So I might come to the public sphere and say, we need laws that say we can't eat things with scales or hooves or pretty faces. And other people have different commitments, and they're going to disagree with that. And if I say, but this is a law in my divinely revealed text or in my holy scriptures or according to my religious tradition, this is a moral law, I have a right to say, as someone who doesn't participate in the same religion, I just don't believe that.
Right.
Now, that is a different thing than we all come together and we say, look, there are certain safety standards that have to be legislated about food. This is why we have the Food and Drug Administration.
For now.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. No one has to draw on their personal, private value system in order to say, look, we all share this in common, that it is better for all of us. We all have a value that eating safe food is better than eating unsafe food.
Right.
It doesn't require imposing or establishing my particular religious value system in order for us to work together towards some civic end.
I consider that the founders, and especially those involved in the writing of the Constitution, were concerned about two things in particular. One is that, as Devanya said in introducing this topic, most of them are coming from England. England had an established religion, and a number of them were fleeing the repression of that established religion. Mm-hmm. Quakers and Shakers and Huguenots. They see that the government getting involved in religion makes religion an instrument by which the sovereign can exercise authority up to the point of violence and repression and so on. I think the other issue coming out of the Enlightenment, and this touches on what you were saying, Lee, is the public space is the space of giving reasons. Mm-hmm. I like your example, Lee, of food safety because, okay, I might have religious values that make me think one shouldn't eat X, Y, or Z. But when I come and I have to give reasons to others that don't share that religious commitment, then I have to leave, as it were, that religious commitment to the side and offer you reasons that all people like us will accept as reasons.
Right. And it's important to remember that that is not the same thing as saying there can be no vegetarian restaurants or halal restaurants or kosher restaurants. It's fine. You still have the freedom to choose particular dining establishments that respect your religious commitments. But you have to, as you say, put those aside and realize that they're not everyone's religious commitments. And it can't be the case that the establishment of your religious commitments as civic values limits other people's options, food options in this case, by that establishment.
And I like leaning into reasons that are not simply because a divine entity tells us it is so.
Right.
Reasons dig deeper than matters of faith. They may involve matters of faith, but one can also be reasoned about faith, I would suggest.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if someone says, well, because God says so, that's to me equivalent to saying, I don't know why, I just feel it. Okay, I get that. But I think one of the things we all, as people who have been trained in philosophy and are training others in philosophy, want to avoid is coming to that point where we say, I don't know, I just feel it. We want to help people figure out what the reasons are so that they can offer them in public. I don't know what to do if you tell me because God said so. That's not compelling to me. It's not a reason to me. And so I just have to leave it aside in my consideration of what we're thinking about doing in common.
And I think that's a really important point because it gets back to what you were talking about when you were making what I think is a totally fair separation of public and private concerns. If I say, God revealed this to me or to my people or to my community, that is appealing to some private thing.
Right.
So when you say back to me, well, God didn't reveal that to me, or I don't think there is a God, or God said something different to me, we can't impose our private revelations, our private conversations with God on another person without becoming an authority over that other person. And that is just fundamentally contrary to the very meaning of democracy. Then we stop being a demos. Some of us start being kings and others of us become, fiefs and knaves.
Also known as tyranny of the masses, which is something that the founders wanted to sidestep as well. I'm thinking of the ways in which we look at a representative process, namely an election, as a mass endorsement of a particular point of view, when it in fact represents a point of view that will tyrannize a minority that does not also agree. The founders were very concerned not only about that in a larger electoral process, but I think, as Rick noted, in terms of the weaponization of religion, that was also a concern.
It's a concern of mine as well. And I just want to say, since we're all showing our cards here, that I'm not religious in any meaningful sense. I was raised Christian, but I'm not now. And I also could literally not give a shit less about what the founders thought.
Well, I'm bringing it up because I think it goes to the spirit of this democratic experiment. And I am the last person to say that it is a very effective experiment. Like, there are places where it's really succeeded and places where it has dismally failed. I grew up in the Bible Belt as someone who was not a Christian. And that was just weird because the assumption is that you are, especially as a Black person in the South. That did not mean I didn't have certain moral commitments. In my household, we read the I Ching, and we were much more oriented to a different spiritual practice in our everyday lives. And that always made me feel like an outsider in the prayers. And I wanted to understand what was going on there. Part of the point I want to make here, and the challenge for me, is that I understand the ways in which something like the Black church or Black forms of Christianity and worship coming out of the conditions of enslavement have been effective political tools moving toward liberation. They've also been tools that have asked for certain forms of respectability that I find deeply problematic. But there are ways in which people without public spaces might find within these religious institutions and houses of worship places where there are broader forums and conversations. Like, those churches were meeting spaces for the civil rights movement, trained people to be orators. Yeah. That does not mean that they should be governmental entities, but there's got to be a way that we can understand cooperation that may emerge in religious spaces might move us towards some common goods and might create some spaces that come to the aid of people who have been disenfranchised by the government.
I think there, Devanya, you point to the fact that if a community has been pushed out of the public sphere, something like religion could provide them a community, a non-home private sphere in which they could find respect, a voice, strength to then come back and fight for a place in the public sphere. I think it's worth keeping in mind that Thomas Hobbes, an early modern political theorist belonging to the social contract tradition, was really worried about religion not being state established because for him, The moment you have a religion that's not state established, you have the possibility of people finding a ground on the basis of which to revolt against the sovereign, that is, revolt against the government. I think we can all agree that Hobbes is not probably the optimal political guide. And to that extent, I think we could see what you were saying, Devanya, that religion can provide all sorts of tools and resources with which to fight for a space in the public sphere.
Heads up, listeners, we left Twitter. We packed up, shut the lights off, and logged out permanently. Not because it stopped being fun, but because it stopped being ethical. So if you're looking for us online, don't go lurking in Elon's hellscape anymore. Instead, follow us where the real conversation happens, on Blue Sky. That's where we're sharing our episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and all the half-baked takes we used to share on Twitter. If you love what we do here, don't just sit there. Press pause now and go follow us. You can find us at Hotel Bar Sessions on Blue Sky. No ads, no bots, no billionaire nonsense, just the good stuff. And it is our very strong preference that we keep our conversation with you going on that platform. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and we appreciate your likes or follows on all of those platforms. Now, back to the conversation.
In thinking about the ways that religion can create a public sphere, can create ways that we push back against oppressive status quos, I also am deeply concerned about what becomes permissible when we intimately combine church and state.
Right.
And I see some of the creep, especially when we talk about holidays. We celebrate holidays in our country as if everyone is Christian. That seems problematic to me. And I encountered, especially as a professor during Ramadan, if I have students who are fasting all day, they are not showing up with their best thinking minds on because they're engaged in a religious practice. It is only recently that I note that that's happening. And that is in particular because I have this funny calendar that gives me religious holidays. So I can do the Buddhist ones, I can do the Hindu ones, I can do Jewish and Christian ones. But I wonder about the capacity of people to fully participate if we are enshrining a particular religious interpretation into our everyday practices, including those that are taking place from the federal government and the state.
When I was in graduate school, I had a part-time job at this computer services company. The owners, two brothers, really great guys, they were Jewish. And they decided to give each employee, including themselves, X number of holidays. I think it was 7 or something like that. And you could take whichever of these you wanted. I said to them, okay, I don't want to take Christmas, so I'm going to work on Christmas. They were forced to say, actually, you can't because we have to be closed. And we have to be closed because the building personnel aren't going to be here and the post office is closed and so on. And so even if they wanted, for religious reasons, to ignore Christmas, the state imposed it on them and society imposed it on all of us.
Right. And we sort of accept those. And I'm less comfortable with the kinds of examples that Lee has suggested, namely a business being able to say, because you are not entering into a marriage that I deem to be religiously recognizable, I am not going to provide services for you. Or, very disturbing for me, is the state history of involvement in reproductive choices
Exactly.
for women.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do not see advantages outside of the realm of public health in having the state engaged in my reproductive choices. Up until the 90s, states were legally sterilizing people because of their race, because of their economic class, because of perceptions of feeble-mindedness, still for reasons, And I don't know if they're religious or claims about one's ability to care for oneself. People with certain disabilities are still subject to legalized forms of sterilization. So it really bothers me when the state gets involved in those, I'll call them private decisions that have public implications.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up exactly this point. I was, however, going to point to the much more recent developments in medical care, where in some states, abortions can be refused to people seeking them, whether that's medical abortions or surgical abortions. Plan B prescriptions can be denied to certain people because either the pharmacy or the hospital or the actual personal doctor has religious objections to it. Now, I'm going to play my own devil's advocate for just a second, because I think this is really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are certain religious traditions that believe life begins at conception, or that the fetus has the same moral worth as an actually born and living baby or human being. Therefore, abortion is murder, is effectively murder. Although I don't necessarily agree with that, that does not seem to me to be an irrational belief. I can understand why people hold it. And I can respect that if I believed that babies were being murdered, I would want to push in legislation that this not be allowed anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just for the record, I am pro-choice. I think that this is, like you said, a private decision that women should be able to make for themselves. I worry that intervening in women's ability to make choices about their own reproductive health is effectively violating the Establishment Clause. It's establishing a religion or a particular religious view as a state view. But, this is a tough one.
Yeah.
I wonder, though, if it is all that tough, because isn't the position that life begins at conception just a religious position? Even if we grant life begins at conception, we kill all sorts of living things. We kill tons and tons of plants. We kill lots and lots of animals. And so the question can't be killing the life. So then the question has to be, is this a person?
Mm-hmm.
Because murder is the killing of a person. And this is why I think some states have gone to calling fetuses persons, because it's not the question of whether it's living or non-living. It's a question of whether it's a person or not. By the way, then we should talk about the ethics of freezing persons. And I don't want to be frozen, so I don't like the idea that we could extend personhood to something that we're fine freezing.
Yes.
Leave that aside. The question about whether the fetus is a person cannot be established on any publicly available rational grounds. I think it is a religious position.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go one step further. I don't know if people realize it, but depending on how you count Neil Gorsuch, and that becomes complicated, the Supreme Court is made up of John Roberts, Catholic, Clarence Thomas, Catholic, Samuel Alito, Catholic, Sonia Sotomayor, also Catholic, but interesting there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Brett Kavanaugh, Catholic, Amy Coney Barrett, Catholic. And I think Neil Gorsuch's Anglicanism or Episcopalianism is a more Catholic version of that. This is a religion that at its heart is opposed to all other forms of Christianity. I mean, they're called Protestant for a reason. And this idea that the fetus is a person is something that's central to Catholicism and not all forms of Christianity. It's shared among many kinds of evangelical Christianity, but the Anglican Church and some Lutheran churches and other Christian denominations hold a completely different position on this. And I think that shows that this is a religious position.
Mm.
Okay, still playing devil's advocate, not representing my own positions. So there's a difference between the moral status of a child and the moral status of a human adult.
Mm.
And it appears that people who are against abortion are trying to establish that a fetus has the same moral status, is a person in the same way that a child is a person.
Right.
Not in the same way that an adult is a person, but in the same way that a child is a person.
Right.
Now, we have laws that say, for example, you can't have sex with a minor because we recognize that there's a different moral status to a juvenile person and an adult person.
Mm-hmm.
Juvenile persons don't have the ability to consent with the full adult rationality that adult persons do. And so, although that limits the freedom of them as moral persons, it does place on the rest of us the responsibility of protecting those moral persons as part of our own moral personhood. Like, we're all fine with saying we're going to agree to protect children against, for example, sexual abusers. How is that any different than people saying, all right, well, fetuses are also children. I'm going to protect them from being killed.
Why not sperm and eggs?
But now you're not answering the question. You're trying to do a reductio ad absurdum, right? Like, which I think you were also doing when you said, oh, well, we kill all kinds of things. Just trying to put forward what I think is the non-preposterous claim that if I believed that millions of children were being murdered every year, that it would not be preposterous for me to try to forward legislation to stop that.
In fact, it would be a disturbing condition for me as a moral being. Anybody of conscience would want to end that.
Can I be clear? I didn't mean to raise a reduction to absurdity or even a slippery slope argument. What I meant to raise was that this is a continuum, and the choice where to start on that continuum, put a point and say, here forward person, is not a scientific choice. I think it's a religious choice.
But we have done that. I mean, science has done that, and the state has done that. You can't have an abortion the day before a baby is due, not an elective one.
For sure.
So we've done that as well. I mean, in most places, it's, whatever, not in the third trimester. So, I mean, I'm just trying to say that I agree it's hard to find the starting point of moral personhood. I mean, it might be impossible to find the starting point of moral personhood. But it's a little bit harder for me to say that there's a dramatic rational difference between someone saying it starts at conception and someone saying it starts in the third trimester. We seem fine with saying that one of those is a religious claim and the other is a more or less scientific claim.
Well, one thing I would say, and I'm not a medical doctor, nor, by the way, am I a lawyer, although I don't know if you share my feelings about this, but I sometimes think that all of us who are philosophers think we would make better lawyers than lawyers.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know about that.
But it seems to me that one thing one could say is if I take this out of someone's body and it could survive simply by being fed and, I was going to say water.
These plants.
You don't get to talk about babies anymore, Rick. You're cut off.
No.
by being fed and given water and so on, versus something that no matter what you do, once you take it outside of someone's body, it's not going to be in anyone's classification alive. I think that's an important difference.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want to make this about abortion, but I do want to say that there are all sorts of legal questions that I think we have to start considering whether the root of these is a religious root. And I can give you another example. I have a friend, Mark Jordan, who is a medievalist and is a philosopher and a queer theorist, and has written a lot about the history of sodomy, particularly in the Middle Ages. And he was once called to testify in Louisiana Supreme Court about an anti-sodomy law because he was arguing that Louisiana's Constitution prevents making laws on the basis of religion, and prohibiting sodomy is a religious prohibition. It has no other basis other than religion. And therefore, that shouldn't play a role in the laws that are produced.
See, I feel like I'm a fence sitter here because I am compelled by things that you were saying, Rick, and I see Lee's point. And then I begin to think about who gets to count as a person in the broader considerations and the way that particular religious beliefs have influenced that. For example, the uneasiness about baptizing enslaved people because of the perception that they would become fully persons once they were baptized.
Right.
The ways in which one is adjudicating moral personhood that warrants certain kinds of legal defenses and protections feels in some ways necessary, but also a kind of slippery slope around who we want to write into our demos and who we want to write out of our demos.
For Dave, demos is the Greek word for people, and so it's the demo in democracy.
Right. who counts. I get bothered by limits solely on the basis of religion about who counts as moral persons. And I also get worried about the ways in which we grant moral personhood to people only as sinners, to use the religious phrasing.
But I think now we're getting back to a parallel to the Food and Drug Administration thing before. If I came into a courtroom and said, this person should not be permitted to have an elective abortion because the sixth commandment in the Hebrew Bible is thou shalt not kill. That is something that ought to be off limits. Yes. In a courtroom.
Right.
And actually on the House or Senate floor.
Right.
That might be your personal reason, your private reason for opposing the killing of persons, moral persons. But it can't be the reason. There has to be some reason that extends beyond my private allegiances and can be connected with other people's private allegiances into some kind of a public allegiance. And this is actually, by the way, why Thomas Jefferson, who is the origin of the phrase, the separation of church and state.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson was mostly worried that religion makes people have competing allegiances. And that in order for the demos to function, democracy to function, we have to have shared allegiances. Again, going back to Rick's earlier argument, it's about what kinds of reasons can I give to have a discussion about this in the civic sphere in order to make decisions that have to do with the public's money and the public's institutions and the public's laws. That seems to me really the heart of this. So the Establishment Clause says, all right, we can't establish allegiances, religious allegiances that everyone has to adopt. We have to accept the fact that we are a diverse community, we're a diverse country. People are going to have their own private allegiances. But to the extent that we're going to act in common and for the common, we have to put those aside.
Right. And for me, that's what I mean when I make these references to an idea of a common good.
Yeah, exactly.
A shared kind of civic engagement. And we're hammering that out in the Dewey sense by engaging in a freedom of thought where we bring our ideas, our views, and we provide reasons, and we discuss those. We submit them to a test of soundness, of rationality. And that is not necessarily without passion, but it is a way of proceeding when we have competing interests.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And just to go back to a discussion we had in a previous episode when we were talking about Kierkegaard, one of the kind of interesting things about the Abraham and Isaac story is that for Christians, you might believe that had Abraham actually killed Isaac, God would not have judged him for that. That would have been a demonstration of faith. But even as a Christian, you know that dude's going to jail for killing his son, right? Like that in the civic sphere, he is a murderer. So I wonder if we have to kind of start talking to Christians when we're talking about reproductive rights and when we're talking about abortion, saying, all right, you may believe that God's going to judge this, but the state can't. We don't all agree.
Right. Hey, Hotel Barflies, it's Rick Lee. One of my favorite games, and I think it's one of the most philosophical, is Would You Rather? You know, the game where you're given two choices and you have to choose one. For example, would you like to smell like feet or smell like eggs? Would you rather run on your hands or be able to write with your feet? Well, how about this one? Would you rather keep listening to this podcast for free and feel mildly guilty every time we ask for support? Or pitch in a few bucks and bask in the warm glow of knowing you're a true patron of the pod? Okay, look, if you're choosing option A, that's fine, we'll still love you. But option B? That's the choice of a real barfly, a legend, someone who helps keep this podcast alive. So don't hesitate. Head to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and join the folks making this show possible. Or if you're more of a casual spender, hit up hotelbarpodcast.com and send us a one-time tip. You know what to do. Now, back to the show.
So are we, by enshrining a set of civic values, replacing a particular religion with a kind of civic religion. And I think, Lee, you gestured toward that. And when that comes up, I want to say, all right, we're promoting a secularism that is about everyone equally being able to bring to the fore their perspective. And I think both you, Lee, and Rick have talked very eloquently about establishing certain commitments and allegiances without the benefit of the broader public sphere conversation.
Right. When I hear certain people from the right in the United States talk about how we are a Christian nation, or sometimes they'll say Judeo-Christian, but I don't think they really mean the Judeo part of that. We are a Christian nation founded on Christian values, and we should forefront those Christian values. Okay, so here is a clear violation of the separation of church and state. And yet, those same people will say, oh, but to ground legislation on Sharia law, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Now, the way to distinguish why it's right to ground it on Christian law and wrong on Sharia law, I think shows what both you, Lee, and Devanya have been trying to tease out, namely, because we differ on these things. And, you know, I don't mind if you think certain animals are unclean. Like, that does not offend me as a citizen. I can live in the same city with you. And, you know, if I invite you to dinner at my house, I will keep the diet to what you think is appropriate. I have no problem with that. It's just that we don't have a shared allegiance on this. And therefore, it can't be the basis of law that determines what is good and common.
Yeah, and I find it deeply ironic when you hear from the Christian right that we are a Christian nation. Because if we were a Christian nation, we wouldn't need to establish it, right? We would all vote for Christian senators and representatives, and they would pass Christian laws. To say that we are a Christian nation, but it needs to be established, is to say we are not a democracy.
Right.
Or I don't want us to be a democracy.
Right.
And it is to have a certain understanding of Christianity that I don't know always aligns with my understanding of Christianity. To tease that out a bit more, I want to reference an interview Maya Angelou, I think, was on the Today Show, and the interviewer looked at her and said, "So you're a Christian?" And Maya Angelou responded, "I try very hard to be." And I like that because I think there are certain deep commitments about care of the orphaned, the widowed, the less resourced that are deeply important in my understanding of Christian faith. And again, I'll admit this comes largely out of Catholic social teachings, but there seems to me an obligation to certain kinds of care and justice that I don't see us lining up with as a government entity, despite our professions about being a Christian nation. One of the Jesuit superior generals I was teaching a speech he gave talking about not treating people as a means to an end and providing resources. And they're like, "Is this communist?" And I'm like, "No, it's Christian."
It's also democratic. I mean, it is also a fundamental principle of democracy to look after the least of these.
Yes.
So, lest I be thought in talking about how there are 6 or 7 Supreme Court justices who are Catholic, that I have anti-Catholic bias, I'll say once again, I was raised Catholic. I was in a Catholic seminary for a while.
That's not evidence of not having anti-Catholic bias.
Well,
But he's not announcing himself as a recovering Catholic, which I've heard quite a lot in some places where majority Catholic.
yeah. So, you know, not only am I a president, but I'm also a member. But growing up Catholic, I have to say it was surprising the first time I heard someone say to me, "Yeah, but you're not Christian." And I would say, "Well, but wait, I'm Catholic." And the response was, "But Catholics aren't Christian." Then also hearing from other Christians how weird Catholicism is, that we have these spooky practices and there's incense and we have the confessional and so on. So I think it is really important to reiterate that the interpretation of what it means to be Christian is itself a religious position.
Think back to the first time you listened to Hotel Bar Sessions. Maybe you came upon an episode randomly. Maybe a friend sent it to you. Maybe you weren't even sure what you were getting into, but then, pow, you were hooked. You kept listening. You started looking forward to new episodes, and now you're part of this conversation. But here's the thing. This show only exists because people like you support it. So if you've ever laughed, argued with us out loud, or sent an episode to a friend, it's time to step up. Become a patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. Or, if a monthly pledge isn't your thing, visit hotelbarpodcast.com to make a one-time contribution. You've been here this long, why not pull up a chair and assist with keeping the bar open?
Well, nobody likes a preacher who goes on too long. You have to make sure that the service ends on time. So, as my dad used to say, you can beat the Baptist to the white meat. So, we've got to absolutely wrap this up. Our bartender is going to be giving us last call. I know that we could probably talk about this for a few more hours, but I thought instead, since we're running up against the end here, that I would just ask both of you if there's anything in particular that we didn't get to that you might want to bring to our attention right here at the end. So, Devanya?
Well, I'm thinking about the extent to which particular established religious beliefs inhibit our ability to be in this public sphere in broad conversations. That gives me concern about things like the establishment of the White House Faith Office, an executive order that does some very different things than prior executive orders that have established relationships between faith-based and community-based organizations.
Rick?
This follows right on the heels of Devanya's concern about the White House Office of Faith. The Supreme Court recently, and this is no surprise given its makeup, I think, has turned the Establishment Clause into a right for religions not to be discriminated against. And I think about a number of cases, interestingly enough, including Catholic organizations like Catholic Charities in Philadelphia and some other places that were saying they would not, for example, put foster children in gay homes because it violates their religion. The Supreme Court saying, well, that's okay because that's not establishing a religion. And in fact, they say, if we didn't allow this, the government would be biased against religion. And I think this dovetails very nicely with the things that I'll say the president's office, because he did not write this, obviously, the president's office says in the establishment of this Office of Faith. What about you, Lee?
I suppose the one thing that I would want to say, and maybe we can pick this up in another episode at some point, but we really want to maintain the distinction between secularism and atheism. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of religious people misunderstand the debate. They think that advocating for secular governance means advocating for atheism. And just following up on what Rick just said, what we want in a democracy is that the state neither promotes nor suppresses religious belief.
Right.
We want a pluralistic society that has political structures that remain neutral on religious matters. But I do think that increasingly many Americans are interpreting secularism as an attack on religion instead of a necessary framework for religious freedom. And I think most guilty of this are the newly emergent Christian nationalists. So, But with that, we do definitely have to get out of here. This has been a great discussion. Please come back for the next episode. And thanks, Rick. Thanks, Devanya. This was great.
Thank you both.
Keep the faith.
Bye, guys. Bye.